Hi students, this week we're talking about ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and the development of the Christian world. When we think about the ancient Greeks, we think about the legacy they left behind them. Their amazing buildings, art that we'll look at shortly, and also their contributions to early philosophy and to early literature. There were three main philosophers whose legacy comes down to us: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And Socrates actually didn't leave any writings for us to see. We only know about him through Plato's work. And Aristotle we know because he was not only Plato's most important student, but because he was the teacher of Alexander the Great. The Greeks weren't united by a desire to be one united city-state or one united country. They were united because of the invasions of the Persians in 480 and 490 BC. After the Persian defeat, the Greeks felt that they were the most civilized culture in the world, and they abhorred or really looked down upon autocratic kings and pharaohs. So the way the Egyptians were with seeing their kings as demigods, the Greeks thought that this was wrong. They believed in something called democracy, which is of course what we practice here. And here the word democratic, our word we use today, comes from ancient Greek language, demos meaning people and kratos meaning power. So meaning that you want the people to have their own power. Each city-state within Greece was required to participate in government, so required to send people to participate as representatives of the local municipality. They weren't as liberal as we'll see the Romans be. Women were pretty well kept in the home. They were not really seen by men other than men in their own family, and they were not allowed to be involved in politics. The Greeks also kept slaves. In addition to ancient Greek philosophy, ancient Greek literature and drama has made its way down to our modern classrooms. And the two main works that we are familiar with are the Iliad and the Odyssey, written by Homer, who is either a poet or possibly a group of poets. The work was originally recited and handed down as an oral tradition, but it was finally written down in about 800 BCE. So that is why we are not sure exactly who is responsible for the writing. There's two main works that we know of his. The first is the Iliad, which is an account of the Trojan War, Achilles being the main character, and the Odyssey, the 10-year journey home from the Trojan War to Ithaca. And unfortunately in the Iliad, Achilles, the main character, he dies at the end of the story. So when the Odyssey picks up where the Iliad left off, we are introduced to a new hero, Odysseus, who was a soldier in the war. Some of the specific characteristics we'll look at on this base are what we call the meander style, so you can see it a little more distinctly here. So this maze-like winding pattern. And that the background is light and the pattern is made out of adding dark glaze or layers of slip on top. The focus or the subject matter of this specific amphora is this scene right here. And here's a little closer image. This is actually a scene of a funeral. So we have the deceased laying here on top of a funerary bed platform, and presumably his family is right in front of him here. The women are kneeling and mourning, and the men are sitting and mourning. And the rest of these figures on the left and right are have their arms thrown up in gestures of mourning. Above the deceased figure is this little stylized death shroud. So all these little checked marks here symbolize a large piece of fabric that would have been draped over the body of the deceased. Here we see the archaic style of pottery, and we call this black figure ware. So you can see the background is this clay color, and then the figures in the front are all solid black color. So this is black figure wear. This is also an amphora vessel, so handles on the left and the right. The subject matter here refers specifically to Homer's writings and to the accounts of the Trojan War. Here on the left is the hero Achilles from the Iliad, and here on the right is his right-hand man Ajax. And looking at this, trying to decode and understand a little bit more about it, we're shown here through symbolism, iconography, gestures, who's more important. So clearly Achilles is a head taller than Ajax here. And he's also holding his spears in a clamped gesture. He's leaning forward more. We know that he at any moment is ready to go to war, to jump up and be ready to participate. Ajax on his right is a little bit more relaxed. His spears are resting on his shoulder in kind of a relaxed manner. He's leaning a little further back, and of course is not shown in the hierarchical scale, meaning the larger figure is the most important. We know that the largest figure here is Achilles, is the most important figure. Ajax is relatively diminutive at his side here. This is another scene from the Iliad. This is Achilles again here, slaying, and we actually know that because his name is written in Greek right here, slaying the queen of the Amazonian women, Penthesilea. So during the great battle of Troy, the Trojans asked for help from the Amazon women. And Achilles, the Greeks, did not know that the people they were fighting, these mighty warriors, were women. So he slays Penthesilea, and when she throws her head back, he sees that she is a woman, and he is deeply pained that he has slain a woman. This piece of pottery is a little different. You'll see that the figures are now red in the foreground and the background is primarily black. This is called red figure wear in contrast to the black figure wear we saw in the slides previous. The subject matter here has to do with the gods, so it doesn't have to do with the Iliad or the Odyssey, but it does have to do with the gods, another favorite subject of the ancient Greek people. And what we're looking at is the death of the children of Niobe. And one of the greatest sins in ancient Greek civilization would have been bragging or hubris. It was considered the worst thing you could possibly do, a very grave sin. So this woman, Niobe, was bragging that she had 14 children. And the gods, Apollo and his sister Artemis, took it upon themselves to slay all the children of Niobe to punish her for her hubris or her arrogance. Here we see Apollo and Artemis slaying the children of Niobe on the backside of this figure. So this style of vessel, you notice, is a little different. Rather than having handles at the top here, it has handles at the bottom. And this is called a crater. This specific one is called the calyx crater. This statue is called the Koros statue, and this is actually one of a large group of similar statues. They would have been used as grave markers, and as you can see, it's 76 inches tall, so it would have been life-size or possibly slightly over life-size, carved out of marble. And the focus on these was on perfection and anatomy. So the Greeks really honored a sense of idealism. They weren't focused on naturalism. So this figure isn't a natural, how we would see a natural young boy look. He's an idealized young boy. It's important to note that the Egyptians and the Greeks would have had a heavy influence on each other's art. So on the left, clearly a Ka statue from ancient Egypt, and on the right, the Koros statue. And I'd like for you to take a moment and jot down what some of the similarities you see between them are. Of course, there's the focus on idealized anatomy in both of them, but what other similarities do you see, especially between the male figures on the left and the right here? There were also female statues called the Korai statues. So the Koros were the boys, Korai was the girl statues, and Koros simply means boy, Korai simply means girl. These statues were used in similar places, so they would have been used as grave markers. Again, a sense of an idealized young woman in her prime of life. The biggest difference between the Koro statue and the Korai statue is that the male figures would have been nude or mostly nude, and the female figures would have been covered. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the Greek women were really kept in cloisters. They were kept hidden away. So to have a female nude statue out in public would have been seen as being lewd. We lost almost all of the bronze statues from the Greek period of time. This is really important to note and to understand. What happened was the Greeks primarily did work in bronze, but once the Romans came along, they were far more interested in war and conquering, dominating large tracts of land over an interest in art. They did develop and create a lot of beautiful art, but their real focus was on war. And one of the things that bronze was great for was for making weapons and shields and all sorts of other war-related things. So the Romans, although they really valued the Greek art, they would make copies of these statues. So they might make an exact replica of this statue in marble. And then they would take this original statue and they would melt it down to be reused. And this happened over and over again. One of the ways that we can tell that something is a Roman copy, so you see this is the spear bearer from the 5th century, and we know that this is a Roman copy, is because this as a metal sculpture, which it would have originally been a bronze sculpture, would have been able to stand up on its own. It wouldn't have needed this support because of the way they would have weighted it and put it on the base. This marble copy, because of its weight and its direction, needed something that we call the tree trunk here in order to support it. So this spear bearer would have originally been done in bronze by the Greeks. The Romans copied it and made it into a marble statue and would have melted down the original. There are 3 main styles of Roman columns. The first is Doric, this very basic column on the left here. So we have the shaft of the column sitting right on whatever platform, and the capital is a very simple capital. Next we have Ionic, so it has a slight base here, it has a shaft, and then it has this C-shaped capital on top. And then you see that up top here, things are becoming a little more defined. This is called the architrave that sits right on top of the capital. The frieze, which becomes very important. That's where often sculpture will be or writing will be in order to tell a story on a building. And then the cornice or the top. And last, Corinthian, the most elaborate of the columns, a slightly more elaborate base, the shaft, and then you see this super elaborate, very leafy capital, architrave, frieze, and cornice. So here you can see an example of the sculpture I was talking about in the frieze. This whole area here is called the entablature. And another area that sculpture would have been set is in the pediment, or the gable of the building. So in the background here, we can see some wonderful examples of Greek architecture. This is the Acropolis in Athens, Greece. So this one area would have been where a lot of the important buildings, spiritual and as well as gubernatorial buildings, would have been in this area. And one of the most famous buildings is the Parthenon that we see here. The Parthenon was a very large temple dedicated to the goddess Athena. It's made entirely of marble, and was originally dominated by a monumental, very large statue of Athena. The columns themselves are primarily of the Doric order, so that first order. See the column shaft sitting directly on this base and no fancy capital at the top here. The columns tilt slightly inward, which was also different from some of the later works, Greek works. The later columns had what was called an entasis, so it started here and would kind of flare out a little bit and then return narrow at the top. An illustration of how it would have looked right after its construction, and it's really important to remember and understand that these would have been very lively painted sculptures. So we're going to see some of these marble sculptures that are here and the low reliefs that are carved into this building, and they would have been vividly painted. These are drawings of the pediment in the Parthenon from 1694. These were prior to some later looting that happened in the late 1800s. And what we see here on the left-hand side, we see three goddesses, and we'll see in the next slide as well, there's three goddesses on the right-hand side of the pediment. So here are the three goddesses here, and a reclining nude male figure, sometimes called an anugi. These are two horses pulling a chariot. We don't see the chariot, but we're supposed to imagine it. And this is the chariot of the sun goddess coming up. And then on the right side here, we have the chariot of the moon goddess Selene, going down. And three more goddesses here. On the opposite side of the building, the other pediment, we have these three figures. These would have been on the left side of the pediment. These are the winged Nikes or winged Victories. And you can see their female figures here, and here are their wings. These two figures are missing their wings now. The Nikes would bestow honor on gentlemen in battle, so those in battle that were being noble and fierce. The winged Victories or Nikes would fly around. Pardon my little baby in the background here. The winged Victories would fly around and give honor to these men fighting. Many of these sculptures that we're looking at right now from the pediments in the Parthenon were unfortunately taken from Greece. So in the early 1800s, Greece and Turkey were trapped in battle with each other, and a lot of the monuments in Athens were being destroyed. An earl named Earl Eglin from England, from northern England, got permission from the Turkish government, not the Greek government, the Turkish government, to remove these sculptures from the pediment of the Parthenon and bring them back to England. He brought 2 ships of them back, and on the way one of the ships sank. They were able to recover, I believe, most of the sculptures, but of course there was further damage done. When we look at these figures, I want to point out that even though they're all in different postures, they're not specific people. So they're very generic people with little facial expressions and very little individualism to them. I want to point out also that when we look at the clothing here, just get the pointer on, when we look at the clothing, the folds in it are almost too much. Clothing doesn't really look like this when there's folds. So they're accentuating these folds. And also the mass of the women, the mass of the goddesses, these 3 goddesses on the right side of the pediment, is huge. They're huge figures with huge legs, huge arms, huge chests. And here is a colored vision of what this would have looked like. In the frieze of the west side of the building, beneath the pediment, there is an image called the Lapith and the Centaurs, and this is a subject matter we see over and over again in Greek sculpture. And the Lapiths were a tribe of people. They represented calm and reason. They were the humans here on the left. And on the right-hand side, the centaurs, they represented violence and bestiality. And these two groups of figures, the Lapiths, this tribe of humans, and the centaurs, this mythological creature, were constantly in battle with each other. In order to try to find some type of peace between them, the Lapiths invited the centaurs to a wedding. And the centaurs got drunk and tried to abduct and rape the women and children that were there. And Apollo was actually the one that quelled the argument. I'm sure that many of you know the story of the Trojan horse. That is where the Greeks built a great big horse and hid a bunch of Greek soldiers inside of it and gave it to the Trojans as a present. And it was, in the end, how the Greeks won the siege against Troy. The soldiers were able to get inside the gates. They jumped out of the Trojan horse and opened the gates for the Greeks to come into the city. One of the Trojan men that thought that the Trojan horse was a bad idea, he had a vision that it would lead to the demise of Troy, which of course it did, was this man here. This is Laocoon, and these are his two sons. So Laocoon was a priest or a seer for the people of Troy, and he discouraged or tried to discourage the leaders from letting the Trojan horse within the city. He knew that there was something not right with it. And the Greek gods punished him for going against them by trying to help the Trojan people. And you see the suffering he's under here. He's being attacked. Him and his sons are being attacked and killed by this great serpent. And in the end, as I said, the Trojans let the Trojan horse in, and the Greeks were able to win the war. And that is by and far the end of the story of the Iliad. One of the reasons ancient Rome was so successful, and when I mean successful, I mean as far as the land that they conquered, really everything we see here was conquered by ancient Rome, was that when they conquered a peoples, they allowed them to maintain their non-Roman traditions. They were very tolerant of people's different spiritual beliefs. They allowed people that were not Romans to become citizens, as well as people that were slaves that had been freed to become Roman citizens. They developed very large urban centers that were centrally planned with planned streets, and there were areas of commerce and community. Also, in great contrast to the Greeks really felt that idealism was the prize. So all the sculptures we saw of the Korai and Koros statues, those are idealized young men. The Romans believed in naturalism. They wanted to portray people as they were. They also believed that family genealogy was strength. So having a legacy or everlasting life happened through having a strong family bloodline. One of the greatest buildings was the Colosseum. It's an amphitheater. Amphi meaning round and theatron meaning theater. It had rows and rows of seating here. And on the outside of it, this was once, this outer ring we see was once all the way around the amphitheater, but years of looting, local people borrowing the marble in order to build or fix their own buildings, we've lost quite a bit of it. Starts on the bottom, we'll see some close-ups. There's Doric columns, Ionic columns, and Corinthian columns going all the way around the theater. It was begun in 72 under Emperor Vespasian and was inaugurated in year 80, unfortunately a year after Vespasian died. It accommodated over 50,000 spectators, and it was primarily built out of concrete with marble facings on it. It was used for gladiatorial combats or combats between men and animals, sometimes theatrical performances or recreations of battle. And one of the amazing things about this, what you see here, this would have actually had a solid floor. What is underneath and open is where all the animals would be kept, and there was all sorts of trapdoors. They could even, when the solid floor was on top, they had a way that they could fill the basin with some water, and they had recreations of ship battle scenes there. It was highly technical in its accommodation and its ability to make people feel comfortable. There were bathrooms, running water. There were great big poles that would come out here that would provide shade for some of the better, higher class seating here. On the outside, so what we can see here, were all sorts of stalls for vendors, food vendors, and people selling their wares. And these are the areas that people would have been selling things all underneath here. You can see the floor here, and then all the trapdoor areas for animals and the quarters for the people that kept the animals under here. Here we can see those columns, the Doric on the bottom, Ionic, and Corinthian at the top. This is the Pantheon, which is the most well preserved of the Roman buildings. It was originally set up on a pediment or a platform, which modern civilization has kind of buried underground. You can see this right in the middle of the city of Rome. You enter the building through a portico entrance. So this rectangular porch-like structure on the front is a throwback to the ancient Greeks. And you enter in through this rectangular entrance into what you can see here is a large round shape, or a rotunda, a round structure, which you can see here. So here's the opening in the ceiling. The ceiling itself is a coffered ceiling, meaning it has all these little recessed panels getting smaller and smaller as it moves up. It's to help take weight off of the structure of the dome. The structure was primarily made of concrete, but it was faced with different types of stone, and heavier stones would have been used at the bottom, so marble, and then as it moves up, they used lighter and lighter stones, things like pumice were all the way at the top of light volcanic stone, and in the middle, different types of limestone. The oculus allowed light into the room, and you ask about, I'm sure you're thinking about weather coming in, and that just happened. Weather came in and would hit the floor and dissipate. On the bottom here, you can see there's Corinthian columns and areas for sculptures to be set. These sculptures now are Christian sculptures, but originally they would have been of Roman gods and goddesses. This is a bust or a portrait of a young woman. So the bust is just the head of a sculpture, and they're generally life-sized or slightly larger than life-sized. You can see she has this really wild hairdo, so curls piled on top of her head, and this would have been something that was trendy. So just like now we have trends in different hairstyles and clothing styles. So we often will date these marble bust sculptures based on the different hairstyles that the women had. And here's yet another example of the stylized hair, telling us that these are sculptures from a slightly different period of time. Romans innovated another style of sculpture, which was the equestrian statue. So leaders set atop horses in stride. It really not only makes the leader larger, so creates a sense of scale, a larger than life scale, but it gives them a place to orate from or narrate whatever they're trying to tell us. So he has his hand out in a gesture of peace or calming. This is the monumental head of Emperor Constantine. This head itself is 8 feet 6 inches tall, and it would sit atop a larger sculpture of him, which we no longer have left to us, that was over 30 feet tall. The reason he built such a large statue of himself was that he took the empire, the capital of the empire, which was in Rome, of course, and he moved it to Constantinople in Turkey. And the reason he did that was that the empire was pushing to the east, and he felt that he didn't have enough centralized control by being in Rome, Italy. So he wanted to be on the other side of the empire in order to continue to push the empire further in the east direction. One of the most important things that he did, besides moving the empire, which unfortunately in the end really weakened Rome and became one of the reasons for the downfall of the Roman civilization, he also legalized Christianity by passing something called the Edict of Milan in 313 CE. Christianity had been outlawed by Emperor Nero in 64. Nero didn't like the Christians. He was very frustrated with the Christian movement. He pinned a massacre on them and was able to get enough people backing him that he was able to just outright outlaw Christianity. So Emperor Nero outlawed it in 64. Of course, in year 0, that was the year we have for the birth of Jesus, his followers, building a following, and so year 0, year 30 was the high life of Jesus Christ, and then by 64 they had totally outlawed it. By Emperor Constantine's lifetime, emperors had to varying degrees enforced this outlawing of various religions besides the Roman religions. And Constantine himself, his mother and his sister were both practicing Christians. They had to practice primarily in private because it was still technically legal as far as the state was concerned. But he passed this Edict of Milan to make it legal and to allow anyone to practice Christianity or any faith that they wanted to practice. And he himself was converted to Christianity during his life. This is the Basilica of Constantine. This is the place that his statue would have been. You can see these great big, we call these barrel vault ceilings, and you'll notice the coffered ceiling here that we saw similar in the Pantheon. We watched this video earlier in the semester on fresco applications, so if you missed that or would like to refresh your memory on the different ways that we apply fresco, please watch this video now. This fresco is from the Village of the Mysteries, which was in Pompeii, which had been covered by the volcanic eruption of Mount Vesuvius, which is one of the reasons it's so vivid. The colors are so vivid. The figures themselves are life-size, and it represents the marriage involving, or a marriage ritual, which involves, the whole thing is set up for us on a stage, so it's very theatrical in front of us. At the top here we have an imitation frieze. So you can see these, it's like the entablature at the top of one of the buildings. We have these imitation low relief sculptures here, and right below it you'll notice that there is the meander pattern. So this dates back to very early Greek pottery. According to legend, Jesus was born in year 1, but the reality is that the 6th century calendar markers, when they developed the Gregorian calendar that we use now, were off by 4 to 6 years. But nevertheless, this becomes standard for us, that Jesus was born in year 1. The faith preached by the followers of Jesus spread throughout the empire. The empire was quite overextended, weakened, and increasingly invaded, near disintegration. The western portion of the empire becomes Europe, a collection of independent, feuding kingdoms united by the culture of Christianity. The eastern portion would survive for a time as the Byzantine Empire. The Near East, which was Egypt, North Africa, and Spain, would become the heartland of Islam. In the later Roman Empire, Christianity became popular and organized. We just talked about the Edict of Milan under Emperor Constantine.
Rome varied its response to this force, to Christianity, at times persecuting Christians officially, as in under Emperor Nero, and at other times accepting it. This was primarily because the Christians refused to worship the gods and goddesses of the state religion, including the emperor himself, who wanted to be seen as an all-powerful being. Little art survives to us from that first century, and that's primarily because there were not Christian places of worship the way that we think of them now, churches. People would have met in their homes and at other times in underground areas such as catacombs or tombs. The reason they met in those catacombs and tombs during these early centuries of the Christian world is because they were places that were considered sacred, and no one would bother the Christians when they were worshiping there, even when they were worshiping when Christianity was illegal. The image we're looking at here is Christ as the Son, and it borrows a lot from Roman and Greek iconography. These early images of Christ often do have a lot of overlapping iconography. So here's the figure of Christ, and behind him is what we think of now as a halo, or maybe as the Christian cross, but this was actually the symbol for the god Apollo. This radiating sun coming out of a god's head was a symbol for Apollo. And we see this detail right behind his head, this circle, which is the Christian halo. But again, this is the beginning of the iconography, and it comes directly from the symbolism for the god Apollo. Apollo was also associated with chariots. So we have two horses, and even though the big chariot's not shown behind him, we have this wheel here indicating to us that we're supposed to see this as a chariot. Additionally, all these vines we see here, these are associated with the god Dionysus, who is the god for wine. And in Christianity has appropriated the grape leaf as a symbol, for Christ had spoken himself as the vine, or the branches that the faithful would bear the fruit for the kingdom of God. So the artists use these grape leaf patterns they had learned as apprentices to Greek mosaic people, and they took them and they used them to serve their Christian clients, as well as the Christianity's situation changed really quite abruptly in the year 313 when Emperor Constantine issued his Edict of Milan, tolerating all religions. But Constantine himself was already a patron of Christianity. As I mentioned, his mother and his sister were Christians, and he also attributed his success in one of the great battles to the Christian God. He had prayed to the Christian God and asked for help, and he was successful in his battles. Under his sponsorship, architects raised a series of large and opulent churches at key locations throughout the empire. One of these was this that we're looking at here, Old St. Peter's, built on the spot in Rome where it was believed that Peter, Jesus' first apostle, had been buried. This is St. Paul outside the walls. It was built beginning in about 385. Unfortunately, it was demolished to make room for a 16th century basilica, but luckily we have this 16th century engraving to tell us what it did look like. The question was begun to be asked in the 300s and 400s, what should a church look like? Most Roman, Greek, and Egyptian temples, they were dwelling places for the gods, not congregational places for people. So they were dedicated places for statues, and priests might enter, or maybe not, to perform rituals and sacrifices, but groups of ordinary people only viewed these spaces from outside. This is a plan of a Roman basilica. We had talked about how the Romans created these city centers in order for people to congregate and do business. The basilica really offered the type of space that they were looking for Christian congregation. And fundamentally, they took this base and had to build upon it because they wanted a place that could contain a lot of people. The plan shows here a basilica, a long rectangular hall. Entrances might be on the long end or on the shorter sides. At one or both ends was an apse, or a rounded end. To admit light, they often had an open center space, the nave, which had high windows above it, called the clerestory, that allowed light to come in. As I mentioned earlier, in 324, Constantine made another huge decision beyond the Edict of Milan, which was 313. He moved the empire to the east because he thought he could more securely rule from that position. And he also ordered his architects and engineers to transform the Greek colony of Byzantium into a capital city that we call Istanbul now today, but during its time was called Constantinople. This head, as we mentioned, is a symbol of his presence in Rome. He built this colossal statue to leave behind in order to assert himself as the seated emperor. Looking at this piece specifically, the Romans were focused on realism, so this actually would represent what he looked like. Slightly crooked lips, a large nose, big eyes, a large cleft chin. Territory ruled from Constantinople varied greatly over the years. Initially, the entire Roman Empire was ruled from there, but by the time the city was conquered in 1453 by the Islamic forces, it was a greatly reduced area. This building, Hagia Sophia, is a great example of Byzantine architecture. It was the third building that was built in the same location. The first two were traditional basilicas, and it was dedicated in 532. Looking at the interior, it's a circular floor plan, and you see these great domes. These are called pediments here. So we have a dome in the apse, and then this triangular area here is called a pediment, and there's a larger dome sitting on top of the pediment. These pediments come down onto these piers here, and this helps supports the weight of the large dome in the ceiling. You can see part of the large dome here. One of the things that's really fascinating about this structure is that it has these early Christian images throughout it and later Islamic images. As we mentioned, the Islamic forces conquered the area in 1453 and would have turned this into a mosque. And now today it's a museum that people can visit. Here's some of the details of the mosaics. If we look at these columns, we notice that they're not Doric, they're not Ionic, they're not Corinthian. They're kind of a separate column unto themselves. They're a capital that's very lace-like work. And then above it, all these mosaics, these great detailed mosaics. This is San Vitale in Ravenna. San Vitale meaning Saint Vitale or Saint Vitalis. A saint was a person who, in the Christian faith, did something worth remembering. So often they sacrificed something for their faith. In the early years, that would have meant that they were practicing Christianity and were possibly persecuted for their faith when it was illegal. In later years, it means that they dedicated their life or became martyrs, meaning they died for their faith because it was something they believed deeply in. So San Vitale is a small Byzantine church. And on the outside here, we'll see these a lot when we look at Gothic architecture. There's some of the important features here. Primarily is this flying buttress is what we call this. So the buttresses help carry the weight of the building and the walls, and rather than having supports, columns on the inside, it pushes the weight to the outside of the building. We can see in the central planned chapel that there's still the apse at the end of it, but now that these little radiating chapels, so there can be an event happening, maybe a baptism or something else happening in the middle, and these chapels would be a private place for people to worship. The interior of San Vitale is decorated in glittering mosaics, including portraits of the emperor and his wife, Empress Theodora, under whose patronage the church was built. Like the statue of Constantine, that colossal statue of Constantine, the image conveyed the symbolic presence of these rulers. In the center here, so this is above the apse, in the center here we have Christ in his youthful young face. Sometimes we see Christ as a bearded figure, which is a more adult-like, stoic, all-seeing, all-powerful Christ. Here we see him in the earlier European style, which is a younger, beardless face. Behind him, remember the Apollo halo in that early mosaic. So here is a halo behind him with a Greek cross in the back of him. He's flanked here by angels and members of the church. And here is Emperor Justinian in the middle with a halo, very Christ-like halo, wearing his crown. On his left-hand side is his clergy, complete with incense burner, holy book, Christian cross. On his right-hand side are a few more clergymen, but also as important, and if we look at the weight, we have 6 of his clergymen here, and we also have 6 soldiers here, showing us that his power in the church is as efficient and important as his power militarily. And of course, this would have been a reminder, as we said, of his power. So even people that were visiting the church, they wouldn't necessarily see Justinian, they would see images of his power. Notice the loss of gravity these figures are set in. So there's not much happening in the background, and on the ground here, you wouldn't see the front of his cloak and the top of his feet at the same time. It's just not the way we stand. It's very stylized. On the left hand of Christ, so the lesser side of Christ, is the Empress Theodora. And cut off in this image over here, there's a small baptismal font that is being gestured to by this bowl that she's holding. She's holding a bowl of baptismal water. And the thing about Theodora was that she was initially a theatrical patron. She was somebody that was really involved in the theater before Justinian took her as his wife. So she was looked down upon. She was considered a little garish or lower class, and she was constantly trying to prove her worth as an empress. So unlike Justinian, who is just shown in maybe in a field with that grassy background, not much happening behind him, she is shown at her place in a church. She's shown in the apse of a church. She also has a halo, which is significantly bigger than Justinian's in proportion to her head. And here is that baptismal font on the left, her gesturing to it with the bowl, her ladies in waiting on the left-hand side here. In this detail, you can see the intricacy of these mosaics. So mosaics are tiny pieces of tile that are arranged in order to give us a larger image.
Here's a very different image of Christ. This is Christ as Pantocrator. So behind him we have that halo with the Greek cross inside of it, referencing the symbol of Apollo. But unlike that other image we had of Christ, the beardless Christ, here he is shown as a strong, all-seeing, all-powerful older man, and that is Pantocrator, the all-powerful, all-seeing vision of Christ. By the early Middle Ages, the Roman Empire had really dissolved. So by the 5th century or the 400s, the Roman Empire had collapsed and people slowly turned to Christianity for leadership. This is a purse cover. It's called the Sutton Hoo purse cover from 625 CE. It was found in northern England in a ship burial, so a large ship burial. And it has a lot of northern influences in it, so Northern Europe influences in it. All this scrolling work here and the animals facing each other. This scrolling vine work is called interlace. And these animals facing each other here, this is a very Nordic tradition. This is called the animal style. Here again, the scrolling vine work
and the animal, the loosely represented animal here. So we have interlace and animal style. This is from an illustration of a gospel book. So thinking about our Bible, our mass-printed Bibles we have today, everything would have been copied by hand, and they would have been very precious and very slow to process readings. As the empire slowly shifted from a period of turmoil with the downfall of the Roman Empire to a period of stability with the building up of the Christian church, and the overtaking of the political realm was overseen by Christianity, there began to be a need for what they call pilgrimage churches. And this is St. Foy. It's a very early version of a pilgrimage church. So there was a large burst in building during this time, and people were able to freely move about the country in ways that they hadn't been able to before because of war. Relics were also very popular. So a relic is an artifact or a remembrance or significant piece of a saint that has passed away. So for example here, St. Foy, this church is dedicated to St. Foy, or St. Faith was her name, and she was a young woman who was killed in the 3rd century for refusing to worship pagan gods. A relic would be either a piece of her, literally, a piece of maybe a pinky bone or a piece of one of her cloaks, or something she owned or used, like maybe a bowl or a spoon or a piece of a bowl. And those relics would be kept in the church that was dedicated to that saint, and they were worshipped and venerated. One of the innovations of these pilgrimage churches was what we call the ambulatory, so this area here. So there could be something happening in the middle of the church, a service could be going on. This is the apse, which was traditionally the end of the church, but we've now extended the building. We have these little radiating chapels, and in between the apse and the radiating chapels, we have the ambulatory. So someone could be up here preaching and giving service or giving communion, and pilgrimage people that were traveling to maybe very long distances to come to this church, could enter in the church, could walk completely around the service that was happening, could visit one of these chapels, say a prayer, light a candle, and then leave again without disrupting what was happening in the middle. This is a reliquary statue. So we talked about relics, and so maybe the pinky bone of St. Foy would be kept in something called a reliquary. And you see in her tummy here, there's a little trapdoor, and that is where the relic itself would be kept. Chartres Cathedral is considered one of the greatest examples of Gothic architecture, but it's also an example of late Roman architecture, and it would have been built over a long period of time. So during its building construction, the styles of architecture would have changed. Nobody really knows where Gothic architecture began, but it had 3 very important characteristics: that the building should reach to heaven, it should have harmonious or very beautiful and balanced proportions, and it should be able to be filled with light, filled with the heavenly light. This is one of the entrances to Chartres Cathedral here. And on the right-hand side, we can see an earlier Roman tower here. So it's relatively simple. The arches are all rounded arches and not an incredibly elaborate spire at the top. On the left here is the Gothic tower, and the arches are all pointed arches, which is a very significant and reoccurring theme in Gothic architecture. So pointed arch, and you see the top here is very elaborate. Again, the ambulatory and the radiating chapels. Now we have a new area. So we have the apse, and in our Chartres Cathedral, there's a new area called the choir, which gives, again, distinguished space for people that are participating in the ceremonies in the church. This is a door jamb from the Romanesque tower at Chartres Cathedral. So this is an earlier sculptural representation. So we have 4 figures here. Notice their lack of gravity. They really look like their clothes are just hanging off a coat hanger. There's no sense of mass underneath them. They all have halos. They all have slight smiles on their mouths, but they're not really individualized people. They're kind of a very generic person. Behind them, very intricate scroll work. Here is the Gothic door jamb at Chartres Cathedral. So the figures are very individualized. They all have very different characters, not a same smile across the board. Looking at them side by side, we can really see a lot of similarities and a lot of differences. So please take a few moments and jot down the similarities you see and the differences you see in these door jambs that were created a few hundred years apart from each other. One of the other incredible pieces of Chartres Cathedral is the stained glass windows on the inside, which give an incredible sense of heavenly light coming in, being filtered through the stained glass. Stained glass had been used prior to the construction of Chartres, but in Chartres it was employed across the board. Everywhere you look, there was stained glass.